This event is part of the Southampton Science and Engineering Festival, organised by the Public Engagement with Research Unit at the University of Southampton. The festival's on now and running until the 14th of March. If you want to comment on social media about today's event, please use the official festival hashtag SOTSEF, that's SOTSEF. This event is being recorded now, so please be warned, you're giving consent by joining this session to be recorded. We'd ask you to please, if you have access to a microphone, to mute it and to keep your video off, but please use the chat feature, which you'll see on the right hand side of your screen, to ask questions, and we'll come to you throughout the session to answer those questions as best we can. So I think it's time for us all to turn on our microphones, Kath and Mark, and I'm going to stop sharing this slide so that we can say hi. There they are, appearing on our screens. Hello both.
Hello.
Welcome to you all. So my name is Lucy Green. I'm a developmental physiologist, and my co-hosts are Dr Mark Chapman, who's a plant biologist, and Dr Kath Woods-Townsend, who is a health science educator. And we hope that you can see us all okay and hear us all okay too.
And we can all see your names now in the group of people that are here, but what would be really helpful for us would be actually to know roughly what ages you all are. So there should be a poll coming in the chat for you to just let us know what age you are. Thanks. So if you could just vote on that, I can see the votes coming in. It's a nice range of ages. We really welcome having all of you here. We're really pleased to be hosting this for you. Okay, are we okay to take the poll down then? I think everyone's voted. So welcome. It was really, we had the whiteboard up for you to just be popping down your words just when we think about climate change, what kind of words spring to our mind. And it was really interesting to see those words coming up, and there were some really quite powerful words there, so quite scary things. So ice caps melting, sea levels rising, extinction of wildlife, you know, some scary future, some really kind of quite hard-hitting words there, but then there were also some positive things. So thinking about the human activity that we do, thinking about maybe reducing down the amount of reliance we have on cars, and thinking about different modes of transport. And what we want to do in this session here, the plan is that you can hear from us in our different fields of work, in the world of plants, the world of health, and our work with young people, and to just really get you thinking and asking questions about what all this means in relation to our climate and how we affect what's happening for climate change. And we hope that it might influence you and what you choose to do.
So we'd like to hear your questions, and we'll do our best to respond to them as you post them. You can type them in the chat feature. So if you look at the bottom right hand side of your screen, there's a little pink patch and then a speech bubble. And we're going to have someone behind the scenes actually monitoring the chat. And if you post a question, they'll make sure it gets through to us. And if we don't have time to answer everything within this just 1 hour session, we'll do our best to answer them afterwards. And so you'll be able to get a response later.
Great. Now, hopefully you can see my screen. So we hear, great, thank you, Kath. We hear more and more, don't we, about the catastrophic impacts of climate change. The rising temperature, as Kath alluded to, the devastation of landscape through floods or drought, the loss of species. It feels apocalyptic, doesn't it? And some of the words you put up on that whiteboard reflected this really well. And this is influenced by the things we do. I mean, just look at this next slide.
So clearly this is a map of the world. And what you can see from the map of the world here is extreme weather events which are contributing to climate change. So 11% of the world's population, so 11% of the 7.5 billion people in the world are currently vulnerable to climate change. And this is things like droughts, floods, heat waves, other extreme weather events, and of course sea level rise that we've heard about. So the red, this shows where some of these events have happened and they were directly attributed to human activities. So you can see that a lot of these activities are being induced by human activities. So it's caused by the things that we do.
Also, we know that there are a lot of health problems in the world that we live in. We're right in the middle of a huge health crisis, aren't we, with COVID-19? It's an infectious disease, but there are lots of other diseases which people live with and sadly die from too. Non-communicable diseases, things you can't catch, but which are responsible for around 70% of deaths worldwide. And we spend a lot of time thinking about ways to make us and the members of our societies more healthy. So at the heart of today's webinar is thinking about the things that we do which are affecting our global climate, but also affecting our health, right from the very earliest moments of development and through to when we're old. We're quite used to thinking about what we can do to make ourselves healthier, things like these factors here, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But we also hear quite a lot about the things that we do to our environment that contribute to climate change. One of those things is pollution.
For example, we hear a lot about carbon dioxide, and this little animation is just to really show the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere as of 2018. So, sorry, as of 2018, it's the highest it's been in 3 million years. And this clip just shows how that change has come about. And so we can see for many, many centuries that it was kind of at a pretty equitable level all the way through. And then in the late 1700s, we have the Industrial Revolution, and you see this huge increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that's being released into the atmosphere. Just see that animation again, okay. And there are a few of these gases that we call greenhouse gases, and we call them greenhouse gases because they act to trap warm air around the earth. So when you go into a conservatory or into a greenhouse in the summer and you can see that temperature change as you walk into that room, it's because the warm air has been trapped. Well, the greenhouse gases act in a similar way here. And if we look at this pie chart here, we can see that in dark green, this is showing us the annual greenhouse gas emissions, and in dark green, 10% of all global greenhouse gas emissions from human activity are caused by deforestation and burning of our forests. I think we saw a couple of years ago with the forest fires in the Amazon rainforest, just the devastation that caused. And we can see that it's just 10%. So we can see that just deforestation alone is causing almost as much CO2 as all the cars and trucks on the planet, in the orange pie segment here. When we're thinking about how we can reduce human activity to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, we can't just stop producing greenhouse gases overnight. We need power, we need to be able to use cars and trucks, etc. But we don't need to be releasing so much carbon dioxide by cutting down our forests or by using fossil fuels, this pink pie segment here. Next.
So here we're starting to realize that the things that we personally are doing to the environment can also affect our bodies. Clearly, some of the things we do for the sake of our bodies will affect the environment. But what we hope is by the end of today to plant a seed that edible plants may hold a vital place in our health and in our climate. So first, we're going to do some myth busting about actually what makes you healthy. Just as a reminder, don't forget we have a chat feature and you can keep your questions coming at any point. If we can't answer them right away or even within the hour, we will post the answers to the questions after the event.
Well, we've had a rough year of it, haven't we? I mean, in terms of health, life in lockdown, the COVID pandemic has really shaken the foundations of the way we feel and think about the health of us and those around us. Now, this webinar isn't directly about COVID, but COVID has made us think. We hear lots about underlying health conditions. You were at a greater risk of the virus if you already had a weaker heart or had diabetes. And these sorts of diseases in themselves, non-communicable diseases, are of epidemic proportion. As I said before, they account for about 70% of premature deaths worldwide. But why do some of us have good health and others not, suffering from these non-communicable diseases, things you can't catch, like of the cardiovascular system, metabolism? Generally, these diseases happen as we age. What is it that makes you healthy? It actually feels a bit like a wheel of fortune, doesn't it? You know, spin the wheel, here we go. Where will it stop? Oh, the environment, maybe. Click it again. Where will it stop this time? We should eat a bit better, shouldn't we? Exercise more? Then we'll be fine, right? But actually what works for one person doesn't always work for another. Or is it all about these genes in the green section here, passed on to you by your parents? But actually purely genetic causes, aside from rarer forms, haven't been identified for these diseases, these non-communicable diseases we're talking about. And actually the epidemic rate of them has occurred too fast. So what is it then? Well, actually this red section here is one that you may not have considered before. It's about your early development. What do I mean? Well, the idea is that building a baby is the foundation of lifelong health. Those first 1,500 days of your life are really important. And so it's not just about actually being born successfully, but actually building that baby is the foundation of your health across your life course. It's what makes you able to respond and to cope with the environment that you're born into. So how do you build a good baby that's set up for a long and healthy life? Well, we think it's rather like building a house. For a house, you need bricks. For a baby, that's the nutrients. And then you need a way of getting those bricks to the house or the nutrients to the baby. For the baby, it's the circulation of the mum, the placenta, and the fetus. The baby does stuff with those nutrients, and it needs a set of instructions of how to do it. If you were building a house, that would come from the architect's plan, but for the baby, it's got its genome. And so it can actually follow those instructions and build the baby. But if the supply of bricks to the house or the nutrients to the baby is interrupted, then the baby will make adaptations, just as the shape of the house would be altered by an altered supply of bricks. And actually this will determine the quality of the baby that's built, the quality of the house built, will determine how it gets on in adverse situations, like for a house during a hurricane, or poor lifestyle for us. So there's a lot of science that tells us that the developing baby in the womb can sense the nutrients and the oxygen that comes across the placenta. So here's the developing unborn baby, a little cartoon of it, and here's the placenta. And it can sense the things coming across. It's sensing the mum's world in which she lives. And there's evidence suggests that the unborn baby can adapt to those cues from the mother's environment. Things like the food she eats, the stress she's under, the exercise she's taking. And it has a few tricks up its sleeve. It can change the length of time that it stays inside the mother's womb, how long the pregnancy is. But it can also adapt and change where the nutrients are sent around its body. and even what's done with those nutrients when they get to a particular part of its body. And this is really important because for some organs like the heart and the kidney and skeletal muscle in your limbs, all the cells that are needed for life are grown while the baby is in the womb. And these organs are ones which control how your body works for the whole of your life, how it handles sugary food, how you control your blood pressure, how you keep your heart pumping for the whole of your life. This is your health. And we know also that it starts detecting these things when it's just the size of a grain of salt, that very early embryo just after fertilization. It starts adapting to the world around it and making the best prediction of the sort of world it's going to be born into. So it really better get it right. Is this then why some of our bodies have coped better with COVID than others? Is it all down to those very early stages in development? And some people around the world have started to also think about how pollution and environmental toxins can also cross the placenta and affect the unborn baby. And of course, these are the very things that are causing our climate to change too. And so we're also finding that they're affecting us from our very earliest stages of development. So the things we know that are good for health start affecting us even during pregnancy. Not only that, but our ability to do the right thing in pregnancy, to alter our diet, to take more exercise, to change the plant component of it, well, that too is affected by the changing environment. And so this seems to be a really good point at which to hand over to Dr. Mark Chapman, who's a plant expert and thinks a lot about this kind of thing, the environment and plant growing aspect of this picture here. So I'm going to take down these slides.
Before we go on to Mark,
all right, Anna.
For some question taking.
Sure.
So we have. Let me just share. So we do have a question, but I'm wondering whether this is more directed towards Mark. So perhaps we could leave this to the next session, which might clarify things a little bit better, and then we can come back to that question, which relates to cutting down forests. But there were some other questions that I was wondering, Lucy, whether you could answer about. So one of them is, how can the fetus tell that the mum's nutrition has changed?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. There's a number of ways that we've researched on this and answers we got. I mean, at a very, very minuscule level inside the body, there are genes, DNA, which is codes for the whole of life, and there are parts of your DNA which are sometimes have little responsive elements in them which can respond to things like glucose. So that's one way, right down at the nitty-gritty level. But actually, on a bigger systems level, there are parts of the vascular system called the carotid bodies. Now, they normally would detect changes in oxygen levels, but actually there are some data to suggest that they might also detect changes in blood glucose. So that could set off a whole trigger of events to actually help cause the baby to change where it sends the blood flow around its body. Back down again at the minuscule level, though, there are little marks that can be left on your genome by on your DNA, called methylation marks, and one of the key triggers for those is nutrition. So they can leave little marks, and that can change the way that the DNA is translated into proteins, and therefore how your body works.
Thank you, Lucy. What about being a twin? How does that matter? Well,
I suppose being a twin is an interesting one, because of course there you have two individuals who are developing at the same time inside one uterus. Everything they're experiencing is in theory the same. It kind of depends a little bit on what sort of twin you are, whether you've got your own amniotic sac or you're sharing one with your twin. That actually might mean that if you've got your own, could your environment be subtly different to your twin? And that's important because of what I just said about those little epigenetic marks, those little glitches and blips that are left on your DNA by the environment. Actually, they could be different, and they have been shown to be different between twins. So it actually means that although they might have the same coding system, the actual tweaks and little blips and glitches in it might be quite different depending on what their unique experience was as a twin compared to their sibling.
Right. We had one more previously come in, which is a really interesting one, actually, about morning sickness. So can morning sickness, when a mother suffers from morning sickness, affect the way a baby develops?
Yeah, of course, morning sickness can be quite a debilitating condition for some mums, can't it? I mean, in really severe situations, it you know, just awful way to begin and to carry on through a pregnancy. It is associated, as you know, it's called morning sickness for a reason, you know, a periodic vomiting, and you would think, and people have given a lot of thought to thinking about, well, the fact if you're bringing up your food and it's actually putting you off your food, then that could be a real nutritional challenge in those early stages of pregnancy. And given what we know about the link between nutrition in early pregnancy and long-term health, that could be important. So people have looked, and they have found an increased risk of low birth weight and small for gestational age babies of mums who have experienced severe morning sickness. In terms of the long-term outcomes, the database are kind of mixed. Some evidence to suggest that it might lead to behavioural differences or higher blood pressure or altered metabolism, but it's not consistent, the evidence. So not all necessarily bad news.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Well, thank you very much, Lucy. So it'll be time to hand over to Mark now, and keep your questions coming, and we'll come back to them at the end of the next session.
Okay, hopefully you can all see this next set of slides. So we need protein, we need vitamins, and we need minerals. And meat is generally thought to be bad for releasing CO2 and methane. And of course, to have that many animals in one place, to grow enough cows and sheep for all the humans in the world to eat, we need to basically create massive spaces through deforestation. So if we can eat more plants, which you can grow at a much higher density, if we can get our protein from these plants instead of relying on meat, this might be an easy change we can make to actually convert part of our diet and to have positive effects on the environment as well. So we're going to look at plants as sources of protein and other things. So first of all, why do we need protein? Well, some of the protein we take in through our diet is used directly, and it's full of nitrogen, and basically all of our body processes rely on nitrogen to some level. So some of the protein is used directly, and some of it's broken down, and its constituent parts, primarily the nitrogen, are used in other processes in our body. Now, peas and beans are full of protein. They come from a plant family that's actually evolved the ability to use nitrogen from the air, because the majority of plants can't. Most plants cannot take in nitrogen from the air, but peas and beans have developed this little trick. They have specialized bacteria in their roots. So in the air that's floating around in the soil, they can take in the nitrogen, these bacteria, and they convert it to a different compound, which is related to ammonia, and then the plants can use this. So this group of plants, the peas and beans, a really interesting plant family. They've evolved this really cool process. And one benefit of this is that peas and beans therefore don't need as much fertilizers as some other crops. So crops that can't take in nitrogen because of these specialized bacteria, they sometimes need to be fertilized, whereas peas and beans, they don't need to be. Well, what else do plants do? Well, you know about vitamins and you know about minerals, and you're told that you should have these in your diet. But what actually do these things do? What are they and where do they come from? So plants are pretty much full of all these different things. But what's important to realize is that you have to eat a diversity of these things to get the full range of vitamins and minerals. You can't just eat tomatoes for every meal because you wouldn't get certain compounds into your diet. So a typical healthy diet would have a mixture of green leafy vegetables, kale, spinach, things like that. It would have oranges and yellows and things like that, like tomatoes and peppers. And it would have seeds and things like that as well. And this will give you a nice range of vitamins and minerals. And here's some of the things that we rely on to get from plants in our food. So vitamin A, that's really good for our bones, and it's important for our vision as well. B vitamins, and seeds are full of these B vitamins. And what they do is they help release the energy from the food we eat, as well as actually making their own energy themselves. Vitamin C, obviously you've probably heard of that. It comes from oranges, but it's also found in tomatoes and peppers and things like that. And that's really important for wound healing, for healthy teeth, and for healthy bones. Vitamins D and vitamins K, they're really important for our bones as well, to grow healthy and to have strong, healthy bones. Vitamin E is another vitamin, and it's actually an antioxidant. And what this will do is it helps fight damage that goes on in our cells. And beta carotene and lycopene, which you may or may not have heard of, they're found at high concentration in tomatoes and peppers. And they're also antioxidants, so they also protect our cells from basic cell damage, and they just generally keep us healthy. Some of the minerals we need are things like magnesium and calcium, potassium and sodium, and they help our body's water balance. They're necessary for our bones. And another thing they do is they stabilize the proteins in our body. So if we take in lots of proteins from our diet, it's also important to have the relevant minerals to maintain the quality and the quantity of these proteins within our body. And then these proteins go into our teeth, our hair, our skin, and our nails in the form of things like keratin and things like that. So a plant-based diet can be super healthy because of all these different things. But what you need to realize is that there's some vitamins and minerals that are typically only found in large quantities in animal products. And if you're a vegetarian, and especially if you're a vegan, you do need to be careful and potentially even take supplements, because it's unlikely you'll be getting a lot of iron and a lot of vitamin B12 from your diet if you're not eating red meat. That doesn't mean that you need to eat red meat. It just means that you need to be careful and potentially have a supplement every morning with your breakfast or something like that. Fortified orange juice, for example, if you've ever seen that in the supermarket, that's full of B12. So it's a product that the supermarkets have realized it would be extra healthy if we got extra vitamins in there. So fortified fruit juice and things like that, just pay attention to those things if you are a vegetarian or vegan. So plants do many things for the environment. It's not just about human health as well. And when we think about having a lot of meat in our diets, we think about deforestation. And so we're not just losing these really pretty plants from all over the world, but we're losing a lot of environmental benefits that these plants give us as well. One of the things we obviously need to keep ourselves alive is oxygen. And we're in a really tight balance with the plants on the environment, because plants take in CO2 and release oxygen. We, as you know, probably take in the oxygen and we release the CO2. So it's quite a tight balance there between what we're taking in and giving out and what the plants are giving and taking. So it's very important that we're very careful about this balance on the planet. Another thing plants do is they store carbon. So the bulk of a plant is actually made up of carbon along with other minerals and things like that. And if we cut down all the trees and burn them, we release this carbon into the environment. And you've probably heard of things like the greenhouse effect and things like that. And if we release a lot of carbon, instead of being careful to store this carbon, we are going to make the greenhouse effect and potentially climate change even worse. They also do other things which are listed here. So they are habitats for other plants and a lot of animals to live in. They filter out pollutants as well from the air. And they're really important for stabilizing soils. If you imagine a field where all the trees and all the plants are have been removed, if there's a big rainstorm and any sort of flood, all the soil will start to wash away. And so we'll start to lose the stability of the land as well. So this can be really important for farmers to make sure that they've always got plants on their land, even if it's not plants that they're growing currently for crops, because it will help to stabilize the soils, which will be required in the next season for the crops that they're about to grow. They're also really important for human well-being. If you think about, especially being on lockdown during COVID, being able to just go outside, walk around a park, or if you're lucky enough to live near a forest or something like that, it's really good for human well-being to be able to just pop into a forest. They're healthy, they're clean, they're full of birdsong, they're full of relaxing feelings as well, like that. So what plants do on this planet is incredibly important for humans being able to survive as well. So plants at the moment, and in particular during the lockdowns that we've had, they might be receiving a bit of a rest from some of these human-induced stresses that they're normally having to cope with. So during the pandemic, we've got reduced traffic, we've got a lot less flights in the air, a lot less people going out in their cars, popping around, visiting other friends and things like that, which is a shame for us. But actually at the moment, there's probably a lot of plants that are getting a very short term, but a really nice release from being affected by humans. And there's some plants that are really badly affected by things like pollution. And some plants are actually on the decline because of human activities. So there may be short-term benefits for the plants around us during these lockdowns, during this pandemic. I don't think it's been established what's going to happen in the long term. We would expect that later in the year, or when Boris decides that we're able to leave our homes more, we would expect that some of the pollution's going to come back. But I do hope that some of these short-term changes that have occurred, we might be able to learn from this. And actually, for example, the government has an initiative called Coming Back Greener from the pandemic. So thinking about what we're doing right now and how plants and animals to a degree are receiving a rest, and can we convert this into more positive changes going forward? We are facing a lot of serious challenges now. So putting the pandemic aside, for the last decades, we know that the world's population has been increasing and we've been running out of lands because populations are getting bigger, cities are getting larger, and at the same time we're having climate change. So the world is either getting warmer or it's getting more erratic weather patterns, including floods and storms and things like that. And we've known for decades that this is happening and it's going to get worse. And unfortunately, the world hasn't really responded very strongly. It's paying lip service to a degree, but it could always be doing more. But there's a lot of scientists out there who are actually trying to make headway in their own different ways to benefit plants and therefore to benefit humans as well. So some of the solutions to these problems we have might include increasing yield. And certainly plant scientists like myself, we are interested in, can we find ways to increase the amount of yield that we get from our crops? And if you look at the bottom left little diagram here, this is just some different varieties of corn, so maize or sweet corn, where the angle of the leaves is just slightly different. But actually, if we can breed corn with just slightly different angles to its leaves, we can increase the density of growing the corn, and we can get up to 15% more corn per area if we just have these different varieties of corn with a slightly different leaf angle. So it can be essentially quite simple changes like that plant scientists dig into the DNA and we look at the genomes and we try and work out what genes are important for these traits. One more example here is being able to grow crops on poor soils. So good agricultural land is running out and we may have to start growing crops on either salty lands or land that is prone to periodic flooding and things like that. And so we, as plant scientists, are trying to understand how plants adapt to their environments. And if we can develop plants by doing crossbreeding with wild plants, whether we can make crops that actually have salt tolerance or heat tolerance and things like that, so we can benefit the human population by breeding crops that are going to grow better in a future climate, potentially under worse soils or something like that. So I'm just going to end my slides there. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up a slide now, and the question is simply, what do plants do for humans? So on this whiteboard, if you want to start writing anything that you remember me saying, or if you've heard of anything, whether it's in the news or from newspapers or whatever you've read, please do post something on this wall right now. Stabilize soil and my mind. That's a brilliant point. Yeah, absolutely. If we don't have these beautiful forests and just parks to walk around, it really does feel a little bit more depressing when you go outside. Convert carbon dioxide to oxygen. Brilliant. Yep, that's a good point. They feed us. Yeah, we're super reliant on plants. Take out CO2 from the atmosphere. Yeah, does anyone remember what that word was that I used? It began with an S. They do something to carbon. Keep us healthy. Yeah, the word I was thinking of was sequester. It's a good word.
So while you're mulling over those a little bit more, we've got some questions, Mark, and I'm wondering whether we can maybe go back to Olin's question about why don't we cut the forest to allow for use by agriculture and industry? So are those things interconnected? I think this was a link back to slide 6, I think it was, in the first pack. I'm not sure whether whether you need any more clarification for that question.
No, I mean, it's all about balance, Olin, and one of the difficulties is that the human population was relatively stable up until you know, the last few decades, when the population has really taken off. And so we've had enough space to have our forests and to have agriculture. But when you get more people, you need more food. When you need more food, you need more agriculture. And one of the things that can happen is that forests are cut down to actually to gain the space needed for agriculture. So it's a really tight balance. And like I was saying towards the end of those slides that I just gave, instead of just saying we need more soil, we need to deforest more parts of the world, it's much more important to say, well, we've got a poor soil environment where we don't have any forests living, trees living, or a forest. Let's use that for agriculture. So let's think about a way that we can develop a crop that can actually live, for example, on soil that's close to the ocean and might be full of salt, or it might be in a very dry part of the world. But there are plants that can survive in the middle of deserts. So if we can learn from their DNA about how they're adapted to the desert, there's always the possibility that we can find genes that we can either, there's the potential for genetic modification, which isn't to everyone's cup of tea, but there are some plants that are closely related to crops that we can just do crossbreeding. And this has been going on for hundreds of years, this crossbreeding. So there's varieties of rice, for example, that can survive flooding. And these were just generated by crossing a flood-tolerant close relative that lives in the wild with a flood-sensitive rice. And then just if you do the crosses enough times, you end up with a nice rice plant that's healthy and it produces all the rice you need. But the genes have come from the wild to make it flood-tolerant as well. So by doing these investigations and looking at wild plants, we can learn a lot about the potential for improving the current crops we have.
Thank you. We also have another question from Podo. Have you seen the film 2040? If so, what did you think of the part on farms, soil and planting and cows roaming?
I'm going to give a very short answer. Is that part A? No, I haven't seen the film. So I'm afraid I can't really comment on the second part, but I will put it on my Netflix list because of that. Yeah.
Okay, that's your weekend activities. So we've also got a question from Olin in relation to what you were saying previously. Doesn't previously, doesn't that cause genetic drift and affect the entire ecosystem?
So Ollie, genetic drift to me anyway, so I do a lot of work with genetics. Genetic drift to me is about having a very small population where you get bad alleles become very common because there's not enough diversity to remove all the bad alleles. And that does happen in crops. Because you've got very intensive breeding to make a crop that is basically uniform, a farmer doesn't want some of his rice available one year, but then the next year it doesn't grow very well because it was warmer. And he doesn't want to be harvesting every week because some of the plants are flowering at different times of the year. So we need these very inbred, very low diversity populations. So we do get genetic drift in terms of some bad alleles getting into these populations. And that, for example, was the cause of the Irish potato famine. There was no genetic diversity in the Irish potatoes, and then this pathogen arrived and it wiped the whole lot out. So we are being very conscious that we don't end up inbreeding a crop to such a degree that we lose this type of variation that's very important, potentially for things like pathogen resistance.
Right, thank you. We've also got one more question, but I'm just thinking maybe we could should we do that at the end for time?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, really interesting one to do with batteries, but we'll come back to that one. Thank you very much. Keep them coming. So thank you very much.
I think it's probably time to take that whiteboard down now, isn't it? If you could, Anna. And probably to bring in Kath Woods-Townsend. Kath, are you there?
I am here, and I'm just about to share my screen for the next pack of slides.
Perfect. There's another question coming in for you, Mark, eventually from Amelia, so we can pick that up at the end too. So look, here we are. We're back at that slide again. Thanks, Kath. You've thought now a bit more about the role of that mighty plant and the science that might help it cope with growing in our changing climate, and why that could be important in solving some of the things that hurt our environment. They're an important source of vitamins and minerals and even protein, aren't they? So part of a balanced diet, and even can help reduce meat consumption. So good for the environment and good for our bodies. But hopefully we've also got you to think a little differently about what makes you healthy, the things that influence us as far back as conception will impact on our lifelong health. We've got to get going on this very early in life, haven't we? And you know, I think there's quite a spread of ages on this call, but quite a few young people. And we do a lot of work with young people at the University of Southampton. So this is a perfect opportunity to hand over to you, Kath, for this last segment.
Thank you, Lucy. So I am the programme manager for a project at the university called LifeLab. And we mainly work through schools and do the science curriculum. And our main ambition is to really give young people ways to understand the science behind the health messages. So to be able to find out for yourselves why the choices you make at a young age are so important for your future health and that of your future families. As you've heard from Lucy, we can really see how the choices we make are going to impact on future generations as well. But what's really important to us is that at the heart of everything we do is wanting to give young people like yourselves the chance to have your voices heard, to be able to contribute to the national discussions that are happening that will inevitably end up shaping your futures. We've seen the power of young people, both individually and collectively, over the past couple of years, with the work of Greta Thunberg, who I noticed was mentioned in the words on the whiteboard at the beginning, but more recently, over the last year, with the campaign for free school meals, and so the youth leaders from Bite Back, Marcus Rashford, Christina from Bite Back, and the Black Lives Matter movement that happened last summer as well. And so I suppose I'm feeling much more optimistic these days that as a society, we're really starting to listen and value young people's voices more. just wanted to show some examples from the last year, particularly during this pandemic situation that we've been living through, about how there are leaders that are genuinely valuing listening to young people's voices and interacting directly with them, so that there's actually an opportunity to hear from them. One thing that was quite disappointing when the government had their calls for questions from the general public, that as an under 18-year-old it wasn't possible for you to be able to submit questions, and I certainly saw lots of comments on that, because actually we need to be hearing from young people to know what's affecting you. It couldn't be more important at the moment, during these times that we're living through, that whilst young people might not be at the highest risk of infection from coronavirus, your futures will be heavily impacted from loss of apprenticeships and jobs, the cancellation of exams, the impact of school closures on your education and mental health. And for the future across the world, we're going to be recovering from the consequences of this virus for a long time. And you are the next generation who will be guiding us through these times. So it's essential that you feel that you have an opportunity to have a voice and use it, and that for us as adults, that we're listening to you, giving you the opportunities to speak up, and really taking on board what you're telling us, so that we can work together to make sure our futures for all of us are as bright as possible. You really do have the power to make change, and that can be tough individually on your own, thinking about what you can do. But be heartened by role models such as Greta, and know that collectively you can cause change to happen. So Greta started off doing her Friday school strikes on her own, and in a relatively short time she had amassed a lot of people joining in with her and carrying out school strikes themselves. So actually just having a voice yourself and doing your small actions, you can effect great change. So what we'd be really interested in is, what will you do? What actions can you take away from this session today?
Thank you very much, Kath. While you're thinking about that, let's take some questions for Kath. There are some interesting comments in the chat, which Mark has discussed and answered, but we have some other questions specifically. What can we do at home and in our communities to help human and planet well-being?
It's a great question. It's really difficult, isn't it? These seem like such big challenges that we're facing, and actually just thinking through what small actions can we take. So when can we use reusable bags, reusable water bottles? When can we not use the car but actually travel by walking? It's about thinking through for ourselves in our lives, what are those small actions that we can take and commit to, and that's how we can all play our bit.
And following on from that, another question was, if I am not in charge of the shopping, which I suppose would be the case with a lot of younger people living at home with their parents as well, how can I control what I eat?
Again, another brilliant question. And I suppose what I would say is that you may feel that you're not in control of the shopping, but if you think through about your conversations with your families and with your parents and other people in your households, you have a lot of influence on what gets bought. And so you can have those discussions at home, have those discussions about what's important to you, the things you want to choose to eat, and how you can help then in the household, help get involved with doing the cooking, and so actually be able to influence what's getting cooked, and so influence what's getting bought. But don't ever underestimate the power you have in your families.
That is a very good point. And can a teenager have a healthy vegan diet? So do they need to take any supplements?
It's perfectly possible. to have a healthy diet. I think particularly thinking about teenagers and actually all the growing and developing that your system and your body is still doing, it's really important that you make sure you're getting all the right nutrients. If it's going to be a really strict vegan diet, then yes, absolutely, you should consider what supplements you need, particularly thinking, I think as Mark picked up earlier, thinking about B12, iron, calcium, iodine. There are some really key nutrients that you need to make sure you're getting enough of, particularly as you're developing, to make sure you're going to be as healthy as possible as you grow up.
Thank you. And we have another question. I think Mark maybe just address. No, that might be previously. Many of our friends and neighbours have been getting cats and dogs during these lockdowns. Has any research been done on the environmental impact of them and feeding them? Really good question.
That is a great question, and I certainly have a lot of examples of people I know who have been getting pets during lockdown. And yes, I have to confess, I don't actually know whether there's been research that's been done on the environmental impact of them. And I suppose, you know, you've got two things, haven't you? You've got the environmental impact of having pets and feeding them, but you've also got the other side of things of actually you having puppies and dogs. That makes you go out and be doing physical activity, keeping yourself active, going out for walks, and the impact on that on your physical health but also on your mental health, I think, would need to be incorporated into any research. Great question, Podo.
We also I don't know if you think it's a good time to go back to some of the previous questions. There was another brilliant question from Podo about becoming highly dependent upon batteries. What effect does obtaining the batteries components and other high-tech items like smartphone screens have on the environment? I don't know whether this was, I think from Mark's section earlier on, whether Mark would like to address.
I mean, as a plant scientist, I have limited knowledge on this subject. However, what I do know is that there is a lot of research being done about making better, safer batteries that aren't so bad for the environment. I couldn't tell you all the details, but you're right, Podo, that we're reliant on various things these days that 10, 15, 20 years ago were potentially a minor part of our lives. And we do have to adapt in some ways as well. We need to be doing more research about things like that. Sorry, that wasn't much of an answer.
Just to follow up, I don't have an answer either, but just to follow up, I think that really picks up on what Olin's put in the chat as well about those unintended consequences of actions that we take. So we start to rely more and more on batteries, but actually there are then unintended consequences on using up resources in the earth. And I think that's what actually, as scientists and as researchers, there's a lot more thought going into what some of those unintended consequences are, and making sure we're being really thoughtful about what we're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. And we also have another question from Amelia about why haven't we learned from the 1950s when the TR1 wiped out the Grosmica variety?
Yeah, I was just typing a reply, but obviously it's much easier and more sensible for me to say this. Yeah, I think it's a bit like Olin's point that for a while we've been sticking plasters on things to just try and get by. And I think it's taken incidents like this for us to really start thinking, okay, it's not just about one variety's been wiped out, let's grow 1 million trees of the other variety. It's about planning ahead, and it's about recognizing that there's this lot of diversity. And just a little plug for some of the research I do research into things called underutilized crops. So these are things that are very drought tolerant or heat tolerant, or they might be highly nutritious, but they're only grown in quite small parts of the world by local farmers. But these might be sources of novel alleles which can allow us to improve the crops we have now and potentially to diversify our diets instead of focusing so much on just wheat, rice, maize, things like that.
Thank you very much. There was one more earlier about bananas and TR4, but I'm wondering whether, in the interest of time,
I did reply to that one in the chat.
You
So.
have. Thank you. You're on top of it. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Lucy.
So yes, I think at that point, this is where we all part company really, and say goodbye. And the session's really drawing to a close. I'd like to say goodbye from me, Lucy Green, and from Kath Woods-Townsend.
Goodbye.
And Mark Chapman.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And to end, take a few minutes, if you could, before you go, to jot down on this whiteboard that's going to come up what you might do next, what your pledge might be moving forward to promote a healthier planet and a healthier you and future for you and your family and the next generation. And while you're doing that, and really before you go, do give us your thoughts about today's session so that we can improve future events. And there's a link to a short anonymous survey going to pop up in the chat feed. You can click on it and complete it. It would be great. And as mentioned earlier, this is part of a bigger festival, the Southampton Science and Engineering Festival, known as SOTSEF. It's on until the 14th, and lots of events going on if you visit www.sotsef.co.uk. And you can find out all sorts of amazing events to take part in through that link. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and goodbye.